It's my pleasure to introduce this week Professor Chad Haines, who comes to us from Arizona State University. Chad is a cultural anthropologist at Arizona State. He works in religious studies. His first book is called Nation, Territory, and Globalization in Pakistan. It was published in 2012. A lot of his ethnographic work has been based in Pakistan, but this new work that he's working on kind of engages with cities on a much broader scale. And this work is on urbanism and modernity in the more broadly defined Muslim world. And it's that material which will go into the substance of today's talk, which is entitled Muslim Pathways, Ethics of Cohabitation, Assembly, and Informality. Just a quick announcement, if you haven't signed in on your way out, please sign in. And please join me in welcoming Chad.
Okay, thank you very much, Joseph, and everyone here, and Jessica at the center for organizing this talk. It's a great privilege and honor to be here today. I just want to share a few insights on sort of my recent work, which has actually been sort of a comparative study of cities across the Muslim world. And it's really, my focus has been on particularly Cairo, Dubai, and Islamabad. So three radically different cities, but all sort of different expressions of modernity and the way modernity is coming to actually reshape the world and people's everyday lives. And what I want to do is actually, well, maybe I should start with this sort of first slide, which really ultimately has nothing to do with my talk, the image here, but I sort of jokingly, that's probably Joseph in a previous life when I knew him back in Cairo. But what I want to do today is actually often when we think about border crossing, most of our interests and concerns are usually about sort of moving above the state. And let me just get this settled in so I can actually move around a little. We often think about moving above the state and transnational linkages, movements, solidarity, networks across borders. And what I want to do today is actually move down and move below the nation state and really look at the ways in which, one, modernity in the liberal modern nation state come to reshape everyday lives. That is, create micro borders in our lives. And so I'm going to begin with sort of a conceptual understanding of how I come to think about borders and modernity. And then the second part, I sort of want to reflect more on, well, what are some of the physicality and the geography of all of this, and how does it actually play out? And so I will look at some examples based on my field research in these different cities, drawing heavily and most particularly on Cairo and a little on Islamabad and less so on Dubai. And then third, I want to sort of sit back and reflect on the actual sort of practices of countering those borders and how we move across those micro borders in our lives and sort of the politics of that. But I also want to embed some of those practices within a broad understanding or sort of a different engagement, how we come to study and understand Islam. Okay? So there's sort of three levels of analysis. And as I said, what I'm dealing here is more sort of conceptual. It's not so ethnographic. As I said, it's drawing upon my research to sort of give life to some of the ideas I'm engaging with. So I'll be very interested in your own kind of sort of feedback and sort of questions of what makes sense or what doesn't make sense. There's also probably too much going on in my presentation, so I apologize for that. But hopefully you can sort of keep track of it all. I want to begin really with just some reflections on how we sort of think about borders. Obviously, all borders are inherently ontological. There are ways in which they shape who we are, how we think about ourselves, and how we think about others, and particularly those on the other side of the borders that we're dealing with, right? So these are just some different ways in which we can think ontologically about borders between self and other, the most sort of dominant discourse that we have about borders. But we can also think about the abled and disabled, right? And the borders that we actually create of access based on one's bodily abilities. We can think of insider and outsider, civilized and uncivilized. And there on and on one can sort of go. We can also think about borders sort of epistemologically. That is the way in which they give birth to certain ways of thinking. And in fact, most of us are very much embedded in border thinking. We think through the nation state. And the nation state is inherently a bounded, territorialized entity, right? And so we have histories of France and America, ancient history of India, okay? India did not exist before 1947, and yet we give it a 5,000 years of history. Yes, there is history in the region that now becomes known as India, but it's not the history of India, right? Yet that's a convenient sort of way in which we construct that. Medieval France, it didn't exist as we understand it today. Ancient Greece, all of these things are in fact anachronistic. They are contemporary constructions of geopolitical borders that we project back in time, right? And so it's been very naturalized. So they're very deep and significant ways in which we think through borders and about borders. But there are other ways besides just the nation state. Our whole understanding of modernity and tradition is also, it's a bounded sort of idea that divides us and them, certain ways of thinking versus other ways, right? And so these are very sort of clear ways in which we also imagine the world and imagine others as being traditional. They're cultural bound. They're this, they're that, right? So they become ways in which we think through borders. Purity, impurity, universal, particular. These are all bounded concepts, which we have also naturalized as a way of understanding the world. As I said, our sort of dominant approaches to sort of understanding boundaries has been through, and borders, has been through the rise of the nation state, a very modern political construct. But here, even national borders, imagine the domestic and the foreign, the elites within a society, the privileged, the establishment, as we now hear in our own political discourses, versus the rest, the masses, right? Citizens, non-citizens, or more derogatory and problematic illegals, right? And so the ways in which these get constructed, I mean, the whole construction of illegal itself is a highly sort of troubling discourse. Imagine a human being as an illegal. Yes, a human being might do something illegal, but to make that being themselves illegal is quite an amazing sort of imposition on the body and on the being, right? That allows us to do all kinds of things and to think all kinds of things about them. And so it's a very troubling sort of discourse and construction, but again, a naturalization of particular ways in which we understand borders. Obviously, geopolitical borders beyond just the national borders, we can think of the ways in which rural and urban become certain types of binaries and our divisions between them, developed and undeveloped, sort of, and I came to of age when the third world versus the first world and the second world were sort of dominant discourses, the West and the rest, as sort of Neil Ferguson would like to claim, of the North and South, center and periphery. These binaries are all different ways in which we actually imagine bounded entities and place ourselves and others within them, right? Now, there are a lot of different theories and theorists who sort of start talking about how we come to understand not just the ways in which modernity creates borders around us and different sort of approaches. One of the sort of prevalent sort of theories comes from Bruno Latour. Some of you may be familiar with his work, but We Have Never Been Modern is one of his sort of books, highly sort of theoretical, obviously French, the way they write. But there are different ways here that are very sort of significant for me of the ways in which, again, a kind of ontological, epistemological boundaries are created. And so it's not just modernity and tradition that we often think about, but for Latour, he actually creates two dichotomies. The first is between nature and humans, in a sense, and the way in which we imagine culture as distinct from the natural. Okay? The second is, in fact, what he calls sort of the works of purification versus the work of translation. Okay? Now, this becomes an important concept, and I'm going to sort of put it on the back burner for a little bit and then come back to it later on. But it's important to sort of see how it's not just where the borders are and who's mapped in and who's mapped outside, but what do we do inside these borders? How do we relate to one another? What are the politics through which we actually construct the self within? What are the debates that take place? And so here's sort of the politics of purification, creating the pure, nationalizing, nation building. These are processes of purification, okay? Keeping the illegals out. It's an act of purification. It's a particular way in which we relate to one another within a bounded space. But it's not the only option that we have. There's also this possibility of translation, of networks, of the ways in which we might actually imagine relationships outside or beyond or below national ideas or ideas of the purity. Okay? As I said, I'll come back to Latour in a little bit and sort of give some more examples to sort of unpack it a little. But again, when we start thinking about modernity, right, there are different ways in which we actually can start mapping some of the transitions and transformations and the ways in which we come to be modern. Now, the philosopher Akil Bilgrami actually mapped out a couple radical breaks, if you will, transformations. Again, the ways in which we start thinking about nature no longer as nature, but as natural resources, something to be exploited, a part of our economy, right? We start to think about knowledge, not so much about knowledge, but as expertise, right? We start to think about human beings as populations, okay? As a population is therefore something you can act upon, you can implement a policy, you can impose something, you can define in certain ways, right? You can also start seeing the transformation of people to citizens. Okay? So all of these transformations, you can, if one wanted to, you can also take them and divide them along Latour's purification and translation sort of dichotomy as well. We can see nature, knowledge, human beings, people as really understandings of translation, of relationships, compared to a more purified sense of natural resources, expertise, population, and citizens, things that are regulated, that are policed, that are purified of how we understand who is an expert. They're gatekeepers on expertise, who defines who belongs to the club of experts and not, and ways in which, in particular as academics and aspiring academics, part of the academic world, it's very much part of how we live our own lives. Okay? But we also have to sort of complicate how we come to understand what modernity is, right? And here I'm drawing heavily upon the work of David Harvey, who's written extensively on sort of Paris, the modern city, the modernist city, but also other, I mean, he's an urban theorist. And when he starts thinking about modernity, and this is obviously the image of Paris itself, the Arc de Triomphe, which I'll mention in a minute, but one of the things that marks modernity is for what Harvey declares is sort of the myth of the break with the past. So as I mentioned, we often think of modernity and tradition as two separate entities, two separate ways of being in the world, right? Harvey suggests that that's actually, it's a myth. It's a construct that we have. It's a story that we tell about ourselves of this division, this clear break. That in fact, at least if you look at it chronologically in the transformation, the making of modernity with the Industrial Revolution, the rise of the nation state, et cetera, that actually what we see is in fact the birth of modernity lies in the past. Okay? And so it is actually a historical development. It's not a radical revolutionary break with the past. But we can also see it as a way of sort of as an interactive, that within what we define or identify as traditional cultures, people that are traditional, we actually see acts and ways of being modern. As much as in modernity and those who we see modern, ways in which they are in fact traditional. So the break is actually not so clear. The boundary between them is actually quite murky. And so therefore we must go into the old, into the traditional, to see how modernity, how what comes into the present actually develops. So we can trace it out, right? Some of the processes, though, through which the myth-making of this break becomes part of our reality is through a process called creative destruction. Okay? There are ways in which we actually destroy the traditional and build upon it the modern. This becomes a very significant and an important trope in urban studies, right? And so when one looks at Paris particularly, and Paris becomes sort of this iconic sort of representation of the modern city, of the ways in which human beings can be restructured to being modern based on a planning regime imposed upon a city. Right? And so here's the Arc de Triomphe, the Champs-Élysées. We all see posters and pictures. Perhaps we've been there. This grand boulevard, the cafes. Of course, now all this sort of the brand name stores, very chic, very high-end, expensive kind of place. But it was a place for people to go out. It was a public space sort of constructed. And you can also see these other grand roads cutting through very sort of densely populated areas, right? These were very intentional ways in which the city was reimagined to create visibility. Okay? And so the other aspect of modernity that Harvey sort of talks about is spectacle. Spectacle of making something visible in this way, in a grand way. But as I said, making pedestrians visible, creating access into densely populated areas for the state. These grand boulevards of Paris were actually built for the military. Okay? It was soon after the sort of the uprisings, was called the Barricades area in the early 1800s. And so this need to create grand boulevards, if it's so wide, you can't build a barricade across it easy enough. If it's so wide, you can easily move your troops and movement into cities. You can't have people escaping, running away into the back alleys of the thing, because now the police and the military now have easy access to those spaces. These become ideas that get transplanted around the world into our cities. We often think about creating public space, Champs-Élysées, go out, see your neighbors, et cetera, walk your dog, do whatever, as kind of a very positive aspect of the city. But what they actually are places for us to be monitored, to be visualized by the state. Okay? So what all this does ultimately is creates a series of binaries that we often sort of are deeply embedded within the modernist idea and modernist project. Outside, inside, public, private, secular, religious, etc. All of these, as I have been mentioning, are very much part of the modern reimagining of who we are. And as I said, there are different ways in which they come to shape our everyday lives, both structurally as far as just what we have access to and how we can move around cities, but also ontologically how we start to think about ourselves and others. So what I'm proposing is in fact a fairly sort of radical rethinking by undoing these binaries, by in a sense moving below and looking at the ways in which people actually live their lives and upset a lot of and disrupt these binaries, these boundaries that are constructed and imposed upon them. Okay? Now these images are somewhat sort of iconic, but also in many ways flippant in the ways in which they also portray this supposed sort of clash between the traditional, the camel, and this modernist city. I think it's, if I remember correctly, it's Doha. Or in Mecca, this sort of the clash between this Kaaba, which for Muslims is the center of the universe, of the world, their spiritual being, and here is the largest clock tower, the most sort of secular, modernist kind of thing, a clock of all things, towering above this highly and deeply spiritual space. The contradictions are quite inherent, and yet this is very much sort of part of the Saudi sort of regime and ideology of doing away with the spiritual side and aspects of Islam. Okay? So these binaries are very real. We live them. Okay? We see them in our everyday lives, and there are different ways in which they're in fact imposed upon our landscape. Now, to come back to that sort of question of purification, okay, there are ways in which then, when we start to think about these processes of mapping modernity, in a particular kind of modernity, onto the landscape, that we impose certain processes that then become the structures in which we live. So some of these, and these are just a few examples, we can see gentrification, or the opposite, sort of ghettoization of communities. We can see gated communities and the security, the boundary walls around which people live in, very homogenized spaces, the way in which privatization of the urban and the city actually takes place. A lot of parks are now privatized. We now start thinking of malls as public spaces, but malls are not public spaces. They're private spaces. They're owned by somebody who polices them and gets to regulate who has access to them and who doesn't have access to them, right? But we can also think of the ways in which planning regimes, the whole idea in which urban planning gets sort of infused into local governance. But you can also think on a larger sort of scale of national planning, planning the economy, 5-year plans, etc., the ways in which these also imagine a particular future that we are developing towards, moving towards, right? These are all processes of purification, of creating what the term I use in my work is sort of absolutist spaces. So we think about gentrification or gated community. This is very much about keeping out certain people and allowing certain people. They are policed, they're regulated. They're absolutist in the sense that only certain types are allowed, others are kept out, right? So this becomes a very sort of important and significant sort of way of understanding modern urbanism, okay? That we imagine the nation as a certain way, therefore we can see some people as illegals. They're impurities. We need to get rid of them. Now, the most radical solution is genocide. You see in the Holocaust as sort of the ultimate sort of act of purification, but building walls is another. Deportation is another. These are acts of purification, of imagining the nation as an absolutist kind of space, okay? And here we just see, realize some of these images are just there to sort of show, but one of the sort of, if you will, these are called ashiawatis, the sort of informal cities within Cairo, in contrast to this very sort of modernist sort of development in the upper left-hand corner. The bottom right is actually one of the gated communities in what's called New Cairo, just outside of the city, a whole development in the desert that I'll talk about more. Now, one of the most clear sort of articulations of the absolutist or purified city is Islamabad, okay? You also see this in Brasilia, in Brazil. And James Holston sort of writes extensively about Brasilia. There's less work done on Islamabad. Your own Matthew Hull, who's a professor here in anthropology, has done work, but really looking at the governance, the way the governmentality of a particular type emerges with this very modernist city. Okay? I don't want to spend so much time on Islamabad. It's a fascinating sort of study and look. It was sort of imagined in the 1950s, late 1950s, built really in the 1960s, designed by a Greek architect, Konstantinos Doxiadis. And it was meant as, and it's the new capital of Pakistan. Okay, so, and it was really meant, and by the then, I mean, it was a military dictator who decided this, Ayub Khan at the time, who was ruling, and he really wanted to create a capital separate from politicians and business people. And so it was really to create a city for the bureaucrats, okay, that would not be corrupted by the politicians who he considered sort of, I mean, he literally calls them rascals, and business people, right? So it's a very sort of cleansed, purified, absolutist space in the way it itself dissects itself, just built in the middle of no, I mean, it was actually people's fields, and there's some villages there that they just wiped out, and then just built basically in the middle of nowhere. But within the city itself, it gets structured in certain ways. You can't tell so much in this image, but if you look at, I mean, and it's all by sectors, and so you can look at the G sector, the F sector, the E sector up above, H and I. That really it's the F and G sector, which are sort of the most dominant sort of residential sectors. The inner squares that you see in each of the sectors are market areas. The rest are all residential. But if you can actually look closer, you can see at the bottom of the G sector, some of the spaces that you see are much smaller as you move essentially northwards, or actually, sorry, that's west. The spaces become larger. It's very much classist in the way it's constructed, okay? That depending on your grade within the bureaucracy, you're given sort of a home, and depending on that grade, is the space of the home, how it's laid out, the bricks that are even used are all quite different. And so in the city itself is hierarchically constructed, both laterally and both horizontally and vertically that way. So moving towards this end is closer to sort of the government buildings, the presidential palace, the parliament, the courts, and then moving further away. So if you're in F6, that's the most sort of elitist sort of site there, okay? And each market area was meant for that sector, okay? So again, I mean, it wasn't policed, so it doesn't come out so clear, so black and white in its divisions, but essentially you need goods, you go to your sector market, right? And so again, you're just interacting then with people like yourself. They're very homogenized in that construction, right? There are ways in which this gets upset. Obviously, people don't live such rigid lives, but that's the imagining, that's the planning, that's the imposition on it. And so when you actually live differently, you're actually living outside the state demands on you. And there are different ways in which it actually is, in fact, policed, not just overtly through the presence of a police, but also through economies, rents, costs, right? We see this in every city. It's not unique to Islamabad. But rent itself polices who can live where, right? Who has access to certain places based on what they can afford. And so these different aspects get played out in the city. And it becomes very sort of, as I said, one can go on and deeper into sort of the ways in which Islamabad becomes this kind of absolutist city. It's very clear in the way it's sort of mapped as kind of a new city just built and just placed, really just dropped onto the landscape in a particular way. But we see this in all cities, in different ways in which sort of urban planning has attempted to impose absolutist kind of spaces and hierarchies within the cities. Different ways in which, when we move down then actually from the city itself to sort of more local spaces, we start to see, as I've mentioned before, gated communities. We see the picture on the bottom, I guess that's your bottom right, that is quote unquote old Dubai. That was built in the early 2000s, okay, so that classifies as old in Dubai. But as you can see, it sort of draws upon this iconized sort of Islamic architectural style that's this hodgepodge kind of thing. But it's a mixed residential commercial site. These are very sort of new neoliberal kind of constructions and spaces, but it's privatized. It's owned by a corporation. Okay? Who gets to live there? You apply, right? On and the ways in which who has access to these spaces and even the commercial spaces are heavily sort of policed in a variety of ways. The picture on the upper right side is more interesting. This is the new campus of American University in Cairo, where I used to teach for several years and where I got to know Joseph when he was studying there. And itself was, the American University used to be right in the heart of downtown Cairo. It was actually on Tahrir Square. And in 2008, they moved out to the desert, 20-some miles or so away from central Cairo. There's nothing else out there. It's just this campus that exists. It's a horrific space. Again, a very sort of mixing of Islamic styles and sort of neo-Mameluke and Fatimid and this and that all kind of cobbled together. But it's a space, not only does it remove the students from Cairo, they're studying in the desert now rather than in the heart of the city. In the old campus, if you stepped outside, there were homeless people on the streets, literally on the sidewalks right outside. It was Tahrir Square, Parliament was right there. You were in the heart of Cairo in all its ugliness and all its beauty as well, and all its diversity. And now you're in this very homogenized, cleansed space. So it's a very different sort of learning experience, and one can get into even the micro spaces. It's actually more like a maze. It's easy to get lost. You have no clue where anybody is. You don't actually run into any of your colleagues because of the ways in which departments are structured. So different ways, even on the micro level, that this campus actually creates boundaries and borders, divisions and segregations. Right? If we even move down lower into sort of different types of spaces that we actually move through, one can actually think about, this is a newfangled sort of shisha lounge, hookah lounge in Cairo that it's a very different kind of atmosphere, and I'll get into the opposite, in a sense, what I consider some more dialogical spaces versus more absolutist spaces. But the ways in which commercial spaces and the commodification of certain activities take place, right, then create a very homogenized space within. So malls, the souk, the heart of sort of dialogue and interaction and just chaos and noise, the bazaar, the marketplace in the Middle East, that just, one romanticized vision and all its sort of Orientalist ideas that one might come with it. All these things happening, and now this is what you get. This is the souk. Nothing, nobody interacting. It's in a mall, highly controlled, policed, who has access. It's hardly a souk in its traditional sense. Right? So it actually destroys the ways in which we interact with one another. In the same way, modern cafes that we all hang out with, the Starbucks, not does it just standardize the type of spaces that we're going into, but it also divides us. We go there, we go with our laptops, our phones, whatever it is, do our sort of work, read our books, write our notes, do whatever, right? I do the same thing, but we never talk to the person sitting next to us, right? There's no interaction. That loss of social interaction is in fact what is being planned, what is designed. That is the heart of the design of spaces today, under these type of sort of this liberal modernity and the way it, again, structures our relationships and interactions with one another. Okay? Okay, what happened to my slideshow?
Where is that photograph?
The souk. That is a mall in, I think it's Cairo. Okay, wasn't forwarding enough, right? And as I talked about, one of the ways in which moving back out to the sort of the city level, right, is the ways in which class then gets played out in the urban. And this is, again, universal sort of processes, but the ways in which ghettos and segregation actually operate. The first picture is an image of, I think that's Bulak, bordering up to Mohandesin, one of the most chic and expensive neighborhoods in Cairo, and one of the poorest and most densely populated. And you can very clearly see the difference in lifestyles just based on the density of the land, the lack of green, et cetera, et cetera. Down below is sort of a shanty town in Islamabad, overlooking in the background a new residential mall complex. There, again, showing the sort of the contradictions. And one of the fascinating things with Islamabad, as with so much of the world, actually, most middle-class people have servants. The only problem is, where are they going to live? Most city planners don't think about that. And so they're actually erased out of the city, which means they either have to take transportation in. Of course, most planners don't think about the needs of the poor for the transportation, so they're actually not part of the plan thing. And the space is there. So shanty towns actually emerge, and these are the homes. I mean, this is actually a Christian neighborhood. Most of the servants, urban servants, are actually Christians in Pakistan, a legacy of sort of the colonial rule, British rule. And so they started building their own homes along sort of open spaces along these little small riverbeds that run through the city. There are some green areas, and that's in a sense what they were allowed to build on. The city's cracked down recently and actually destroyed and tore down these areas, but making life for the middle class and upper class, they're more difficult because now their servants, it creates a problem, right? So these contradictions are very much part of the urban. So coming back to Latour and these processes of purification, okay? And we can see these taking place in a variety of different ways, historically as well as contemporary. So when we think about purification, okay, some of the sort of the key examples would be something like the Inquisition, the Holocaust, nation building, our own Patriot Act passed after September 11th. These are all acts and histories of purification, the ways in which a particular idea is then set in policy to cleanse that which is then impure, okay? And be it ideas, religious ideas in the Inquisition versus, a people in the Holocaust. But you also have the ways within cities, as I was talking about, gentrification, gated communities, but even things like neighborhood watch, right? There are ways in which we start policing one another and policing our own spaces to actually keep out. He looks suspicious. Let me just call the police just in case, make sure kind of thing. Or you just kill him, as in the cases here in the United States, right? And so we ourselves become part of these processes. They're not just imposed, but they're internalized. The ways in which we watch one another. We expect certain behaviors. Okay? We have, in Arizona, we have a self-proclaimed street preacher, okay, who's anti-woman, anti-gay, and anti-Muslim. So very straightforward. But a lot of his hate that he preaches on campus, and some particularly to women, he wears signs that, if you wear certain things, you deserve to get raped, et cetera, et cetera. It's an act of policing, right? It's a very misogynist act, but it's a purifying act. Now, these are sort of extreme ways in which we police, but there are others. We don't even need to get into political discourse today, but that's there as well. These are ways in which we police the body, and we have certain expectations, the ways in which we police what people wear, and the expectations we have. We see this at all levels, okay? And in all cultures and communities. And so the gendered aspect of that also needs to be engaged, and the ways in which access is allowed based on the perceived purity of the body, right? But other ways we can also see, as I say, is sort of cultures of shame and honor, the misogyny, this sort of the puritanism and fundamentalism, that these are all acts of purifying. Purify the religion. That's the fundament. Let's go back to the fundamentals, right? Shame and honor. And they exist in every culture. I mean, somebody who works in Pakistan like myself, there are often cases of honor killings, right? We often hear about them. There was one just recently this summer, very sort of horrific sort of case of a brother killing his sister, okay, who had a social media presence, right? And so, it gets justified, honor killing, she brought shame to the family, right? This is Pakistani or a Muslim, particularly it's a Muslim sort of practice. But if you look at 85% of the cases of domestic abuse and rape in the United States, they're about shame and honor, right? It's about people, your perpetrator. It's their claim to a right over your body, right? Or that you brought shame and embarrassment to him, so therefore he can lash out in certain violent ways. We don't call it honor killing. We call it domestic abuse or this or that. But that's really ultimately what it's about. And so the ways in which misogyny actually gets naturalized and integrated into these practices becomes extremely significant and important to really understand this genderedization of space and the ways in which we live the everyday. Okay? But I want to move on. Okay? So we see the ways in which purity works. And so I want to move on to start thinking about how we might imagine sort of what's the opposite? What are other possibilities of sort of living in the world? What are the ways in which we can actually construct relationships and networks and interact with one another? And what are sort of the ethics then that we can draw upon for cohabitation and living together? Well, one way to start thinking about this, and again, this is drawing a bit heavy on David Harvey's work, but is this contrast between borders and enclosures, or between public spaces and commons. As I mentioned, public space is state-created. Okay? It's defined by the state. It's planned. The Champs-Élysées, Central Park. Okay? These are state projects, or else they're privatized. The mall, the cafe, right? They're defined by the market and capitalist interests and profit making. So they are, in fact, not that natural. Okay? But they're very bounded of who has access to them. And so when you start thinking about these type of things, as I said, they're based on zoned, they're policed, and ultimately they are there to protect the interests of power. So we often think about public space as a positive thing. It's a place we can go and congregate and see one another. And yes, that is important. It's not so black and white. But ultimately, they are also about power. Okay? Which is also why that self-regulation aspect of it becomes important, and particularly the genderization of public space. But if we move on and start thinking about the commons, okay? And this gets a complicated debate. It sort of goes beyond our discussion here about the commons and what it is and the tragedy of the commons. It goes back to the 1960s. It was based on the example was actually on a pastoralist, so that's why the picture of the cows. But what's important is to start imagining different ways in which we can think about a place that is actually about our relationships, that are outside the state and the market. They become places where we can think about communal, ethical or moral practices, right? Where we think about ourselves not as independent individuals interacting and encountering one another, but actually as interdependent human beings. And what are the sort of the cultural and moral and ethical ways in which we can imagine our interdependence with one another becomes then extremely significant. But ultimately, when we start thinking about the commons and its importance for us as human beings, not as people, if we go back to that Bilgrami example, or citizens, but as human beings, we also see that there are places where we are protected against the intrusion of the state in the market, against those power structures. Okay? And if you have questions about the commons, I'm willing to sort of perhaps engage that in the question and answer period, because as I said, it sort of goes a little beyond. So what are some of these places of the commons? What are some of these practices then that we might start looking at? Okay? This is my transitional slide, and just reimagining our place. Okay? I draw heavily upon Bansky in all my image work, but that this is where we get into my ideas of cohabitation, assembly, and informality. That these three, and there are many other sort of catchphrases that we can use as ways of understanding an ethics of the commons, but these three particularly, I think, are significant. And I'll come back and unpack some of these images in a minute. So first is this idea of cohabitation, right? The ways in which, and the various ways in which we can start thinking about our relationship with one another. And that is, in a sense, as interdependent and not as independent individuals. This first image is actually one of the alleys in one of the informal cities within Cairo. The second is just, I think it's actually during Ramadan, after the break of fast in downtown Cairo. But the ways in which people come together in different ways, and one starts experiencing the diversity and the cultural richness around them, or the ways in which they imagine community and belonging and their responsibilities to one another. One ways we can start thinking about this is through the lens of precarity. Okay? Judith Butler develops this ideal quite extensively in her work on assembly. But the ways in which, as precarious as our lives are, we are actually dependent on others, which often we sort of neglect, and particularly in our liberal imaginaire, we sort of deny that idea, so hanging on to our individuality, our individualness, our rationality, that to see ourselves actually dependent or interdependent then is actually a fairly radical move and shift into rethinking our relationship to one another. It also gives rise to what we might call sort of the ethics of nearness. That is, how do we actually encounter one another? What are the ethical ways of interacting, right? So we have a lot of sort of liberal values, tolerance, equality, right? But if one thinks about tolerance, for example, as an ethics of nearness, I tolerate you. You're different, but hey, that's okay. But that's very different than kind of this culture, this ethics of interdependence and precarity. Tolerance itself is basically, I accept you. It automatically creates a hierarchy. I get to define you and decide you as somebody who I will tolerate. Right? But if you even think of toleration, apartheid, segregation, this is tolerance. I accept you in society, just live over there. Don't live next to me, right? That's tolerance. Now that's a tolerance that a lot of people don't accept anymore, and yet we still practice this. All our cities are sort of racially segregated in different ways, right? And so how do we start to rethink that? Interestingly, Sayyid Qutb, who many people sort of the Egyptian sort of thinker around the Muslim Brotherhood, start to think about as a very problematic sort of social thinker and philosopher, and many of his ideas perhaps are. But he also has some very interesting insights too. And like any philosopher, we can perhaps cherry pick some ideas out of them and ignore others, as we do with all our Western philosophers, most of who are, a lot of their ideas are extremely sort of corrupt and problematic, and yet we still hold them up in such high esteem. But with Sayyid Qutb, he has this contrast, this idea of charity, okay, which is a very sort of Christian idea based on, again, my sense of responsibility to you. But in so doing, it actually creates a difference between you and I as the giver, you as the receiver, which is a very different concept than the practice of zakat in Islam, which is often translated as charity, right? But it's a very different practice with a very different intention behind it. It's an intention of one's responsibility of living in a community. It's not an act of giving, but it's an act of purifying, of building community. Okay? It's not based on dependency, as we see often even on the global scale with the ways in which donor countries give to the third world, the poor, help crises, Haiti now, this crisis, next year this crisis, on and on and on, right? It automatically structures and reproduces a hierarchy between donor and receiver rather than seeing us as interconnected. Okay? And it gets more complicated, again, argument that Qutb develops, but it's a really fascinating sort of contrast to start to see how we can actually, the ethics that we can draw upon. And that many of the liberal ethics that we sort of assume as being so perfect are actually quite problematic in the way they actually create and reproduce division. Now, when we think about assembly, obviously the most iconic comes Tahrir Square, okay, in 2011, the 18 days, January 25th revolution. And there are a lot of fascinating things one can get into, and this image is particularly interesting because just the ways in which one starts to see this whole highly informal, undeveloped space becomes organized in certain ways, but just based on people doing it, right? It's not planned, it just happened, okay? That becomes important. Now, a lot of things are going on under the surfaces, there's a lot of politics there, but it's the lack of planning, and it's, in a sense, an assembly that exists under the state. It's stateless. It's not driven by an ideology. It's not driven by an institution. It's not really driven even by a particular vision, which is perhaps why it also failed, but in many ways was also deeply successful. But the fascinating thing, I think, with this assembly, or what I sort of call these comings together, the ways in which very sort of informally people gather together, that one can also think of what happened outside or beyond Tahrir Square. The ways in which communities came together in certain ways to protect. During those 18 days, the police disappeared from the streets, right? So a lot of neighborhoods got together and created their own sort of neighborhood watches to protect against potential looters, etc., right? Interestingly, there are a couple neighborhoods that were actually looted during this time, but given Cairo has a population of over 20 million people, it's actually quite amazing there was not more. One of those neighborhoods was Mohandasin, okay, which backed up to this sort of informal city, and there are a lot of tensions there that got played out during this time. But one of the other areas that got looted, or where a lot of sort of theft started to take place, was in that area called New Cairo, out in the desert, where all these gated communities are, where American University is, because there's no community. We call it a gated community, but there's no community. It's just a place where people live. There's no relationship with one another. They couldn't organize. There's no policing. There's no interacting with the neighbors to say, okay, let's protect ourselves. They were easy targets, right? And on in different ways in which then, and even for the next year, year and a half, people organize themselves in certain ways, becomes quite significant. But when we think about assembly and coming together, and as I said, I'm trying to relate this both sort of conceptually, but also tie it into sort of ways in which a lot of these ideas are inherently Islamic, but not necessarily, or certainly not uniquely Islamic, right? But they are very much part of the Islamic heritage. So obviously the most classic sort of example one can come up with this sort of assembly is obviously Hajj, right? And the ways in which we experience the diversity of the Muslim world, the richness of the cultural differences that make up Islam. But also more informally, this other image is actually a Sufi shrine in Lahore, Pakistan. Every Thursday night, this doula player performs in the ways in which people come together. It's a fascinating space where actually very lower class, working class individuals gather And yet there's also a lot of money, obviously, that supports this. So a lot of wealthy people who also give to make this happen. And so it's a really fascinating space that really upsets a lot of, particularly in the neighborhood, which is a very traditional middle-class neighborhood of Lahore where this is located, upsets a lot of the ideas of being purified, right? And obviously another really powerful way is not just is Tahrir Square, but after the revolution. For about a year, year and a half, it remained as it had been after the revolution. So this was taken, actually this picture was Valentine's Day of 2012 when I was there. So one sees that there's still people coming out. It's almost a memorial, but memorials are not very dialogical. This is a very dialogical space, interacting with what happened a year ago. People were there loitering around, telling stories of what they did, where they were during those days. All these memories of the burnt out things. There was a photograph exhibit, all this other stuff going on. There are also T-shirts for sale that vendors were making, tea stalls set up that you could just sit then on the square, drink tea, and sort of watch what was happening. It was ways in which people remembered, interacted with one another, created community about, in some ways, a nostalgia for Tahrir Square and for what it came to represent, a very creative, imagined, uprising kind of thing. But that itself was very powerful, right? Now, today, this is Tahrir Square. No dialogue, no place do people encounter one another. The memorialization isn't of the uprising, but of the state, right? And so this very, what I might consider anarchist space, right? This very dialogical space of interaction then gets imposed by the state and memorialized in a certain way to a certain memory is only allowed, right? Now, as I was mentioning, the other idea that I'm talking about when we start talking about sort of the ethics of cohabitation is the significance of informality. All those gatherings are themselves informal. There's nothing that sort of draws people. It's not driven by ideology or market interests or others. Just people coming together, right, at certain times. But there are also ways in which they organize to actually do things and accomplish things. And so one of the stories there is after the revolution, the Egyptian state pretty much collapsed. For about a year, there's very little presence of the state in everyday life. And yet, it functioned in really creative and imagined ways, the ways in which people came together, architects and development workers, AUC students, the elites of Cairo, coming together, working on the streets, organizing, community organizing, doing things. This is one example taken, I think it's October 6th city, just outside of Cairo, one of the satellite cities built under the Mubarak regime. But this was a part of that city where there's a highway that goes around it, the Ring Road, that connects it to the rest of Cairo. But this particular side of the city had no access to the highway, to the Ring Road. Right? So they had to drive several kilometers through the city, taking a lot of time before they could get onto the ramp to get onto the highway. So what did? They built their own ramp. Right? This informality, this creativity to overcome an obstacle, we as human beings have. We don't require the state. We don't require an NGO. We don't require a donor nation to give us something to build it. We can do it, right? And this is what some of these possibilities are, right? So another way of thinking about informality is also, in a sense, particularly is the marketplace. And I'll end it here. But one can start to see sort of the transition in different types of markets. And here, these images are all from Islamabad. But the first is a particular, this in the upper, never get left-hand side, is a particular market that's actually part of Islamabad. But it was the first market that was built when the city was being built in the 1960s. And so it's not one of the sector markets, okay, which is the picture below it, a very sort of planned, cleansed kind of space. But that original market is very much what we still sort of consider, I mean, Orientalist terms, Oriental or Asian market. It's chaotic. People are bargaining, you're interacting kind of thing, right? And then the final picture is of a contemporary mall built just recently within Islamabad, right? Completely different space. And there are different ways in which that informality gets mapped out. And just think about it. I mean, many of us who are, Americans, brought up, raised here, we go someplace where prices aren't fixed and we have to bargain, right? Some of us get kind of uncomfortable with that. It's a little bizarre kind of practice to bargain a few cents here, a dollar, whatever it is, kind of thing. But it's not just about the price. In bargaining, you're interacting, you're communicating. It's a communicative act, right? It's dialogical. There's an exchange taking place, right? Now you go to any store, there's a price tag. You don't even need a clerk. You interact with nobody. You just pick up the item you want, you try it on, whatever, take it to the counter, pay, leave. No interaction whatsoever. Your only interest is the commodity, not the people there, right? So informality is not just the ways in which the space is organized, but the ways in which it demands particular behaviors. Right? And so all of these become quite significant in our understanding, I think, of the possibilities of sort of living in the city, of upsetting the normative, the purified, or the claims thereof. Okay? And they're dialogical. The fascinating, this one on the upper right, the cops. Okay? This actually happened while I was there in 2012. It was really fascinating. I went there first day, and cops are gays. Okay? It's a very anti-cop sort of statement. And of course, I don't have that picture. I have a cousin who happens to be a cop, so I had to take a picture of that and send it to him. But then the next day I went back, and it was changed. And homophobia is anti-revolutionary. Okay? It's graffiti, but it's dialogical, right? It's changed. People interact with it. People send out one message, people counter that message, right? And that is what is lost. Right? And so how do we sort of recapture that? And so when we start talking about borders and border crossing, it isn't just so much about the sort of the geopolitics and moving up above and the transnational, but in our everyday lives. What borders are we crossing? How do we encounter, and what are the ethics that we draw upon, right, to engage one another, to interact, to live as human beings? Thank you very much. I'm open to
questions.
yes.
Thank you for coming and talking with us today. I really enjoyed it. So you talk about, I really like this idea of space and borders as acts of purification, and not thinking of borders, like I always think of borders as territorial lines, whatnot, and you did talk about zoning and whatnot. We are also trying to talk about borders in a more abstract way.
Mm-hmm.
And so this idea of purifying people and demanding certain behaviors and whatnot. With that said, I'm wondering if you would possibly consider if national frameworks or skeletons such as like a nationalized education curriculum, if that could be abstractly thought of as a sort of purifying border or not.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And in different ways in which it's not just the knowledge that gets standardized in a certain way, right? But the expectations of this exam system, et cetera, a set of practices. I mean, schools, the way they're structured, are ultimately institutions of discipline, right? Get up at 6 o'clock or whatever time you get up, go to school at 7 o'clock, 7:30. I mean, it's temporal, so that you are actually molded into a capitalist work ethic through your schooling, through that disciplining, the ways in which the body is disciplined in certain ways as well, through it, okay? So there are multiple things that are taking place within schools. We put a lot of emphasis on textbooks, which is significant, the type of knowledge that we're actually taught, right? Or information, or often misinformation that we're given in schools, right? And so it's all purification, intellectually, but also in a sense bodily as well. So yes. Yes.
Well, the overall impact of your talk on me is to make me feel very manipulated.
By me or by somebody else?
By-
No.
No,
Yeah,
just
yeah.
in general by
Mhm.
society, in the educational system even, as you just detailed.
Mm-hmm.
But one of the things that really hits me about this is the idea that we have these imposed borders that we're crossing all the time. But the idea of global warming suggests that we are citizens of the planet.
Mm-hmm.
And if we take the idea of the citizen developed within nationalism and apply it to our interdependence with the rest of the biological world, then the natural versus human dichotomy breaks down.
Right.
And we are into a completely different zone in which there are no boundaries.
Yeah. It's extremely important. How do we start imagining this? And that's, again, Harvey, in his discussion of commons, actually, is global warming is the major thing. Often when we think about commons, we think of very sort of micro spaces. So the original example by Garrett Hardin back in the 1960s was of a pasture land, right, where people all bring their cows and the pasture is held in common. Everybody is cost benefiting. So within a couple of years, the pasture is destroyed because they want it's free grazing. So everybody brings cows, more cows, et cetera, and ultimately nature's destroyed, right? His concern was actually population control. So he translated into, well, population's increasing, it needs to be controlled. So his solution was actually deep and heavy state regulation, okay? But another interpretation of that sort of problem with the commons is, well, we need free markets. If in fact, people could buy and sell their access to the market and they realized cost-benefit analysis, et cetera, and did this, they would act rationally in a rational sort of way within the market and then protect the pasture or have different pasture lands. And that's another sort of interpretation of it, and that then gets translated. So Harding's sort of state regulation over population becomes the sort of liberal kind of state response. The free market response becomes the neoliberal response to that. But one of the questions that nobody asks is, well, what if all the cows are also held in collectively, not just the pastures? What if the whole community owns all the cows? Nobody asked that question, right? But then we have the work of Elinor Ostrom, who's the first woman to receive a Nobel Prize in economics some years ago, who worked on this issue and this question, and the place then of community in actually regulating the commons and this pasture land. And she actually saw that there were a variety of cultural and ethical ways, and what she calls sort of the moral praxis, that people came together and actually solved the problems. Okay, our pasture's starting to be degraded, we need to do something. They do something. They find another pasture, they cut back, they do whatever it is, right? They have sets of practices and cultures to deal with issues. So Harvey takes up this idea, but then he says, well, how does that work on the global scale? With climate change, we're not all going to sit down and come up with a solution. We can't. We're not a community, right? But we have to imagine ourselves as such to actually see it. So for Harvey, there are actually ways in which then transnational institutions have to be encouraged and developed to regulate and protect the commons, which is particularly the planet, right? And particularly in light of climate change, right? So that's one sort of imagining, right? But that imagining is based on those institutions, are they embedded within the Westphalian modern state system, nation-state system, like the United Nations, which isn't really a transnational organization, it's nationalist. It's predicated on nations coming together, acting as on their individual interests, not on collective interests? Can we rethink sort of a transnational public sphere of people coming together? And so works of like Nancy Fraser, somebody who's really sort of struggling, well, what would that look like? We don't have it. I mean, the internet has provided us certain opportunities, but the internet itself is also continuously also driven by market interests often. And so it doesn't always allow us to interact in certain ways, or structures our interactions in certain ways through likes and dislikes and friends, quote unquote, right? As with Facebook, or just 150 sort of, spaces to type something out in a message on Twitter or whatever it is, right? And so it structures our interactions in certain ways. So how can we break that down? And there are no solutions. And so we're still embedded within this sort of the Westphalian territorialized nation state. And most of our solutions still operate through that and will be failures as such. And so we have to start imagining that. But in many ways, it's this below that allows us, that gives us, how can we translate our ethics of nearness into an ethics of farness and beyond? That is, those I don't actually encounter in my everyday life, but who are part of this interdependent world that I live in, right? So, I mean, it's a struggle. There's no easy answer. But how do we start imagining that then becomes significant? Yes?
As an example, you used Paris,
Mm-hmm.
but you didn't continue comparing the comparison. Where do you see, for example, in Paris, a failure of this common space or the getting together of the population?
Mm-hmm.
My question is, you used what was it, Cairo,
Mhm.
for example, and you showed Tahrir Square during the uprising,
Mhm.
after, few years after the
Right.
uprising. And you mentioned the example of the state imposing itself upon the people,
Mm-hmm.
so to speak. Why do you think that? Because the people can come and close the roads, and this time they'll be on grass.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm not so sure that the comparison, starting with Paris,
Mm.
and using that as a sort of an example of fascism, and that this was the road to Champs-Élysées, for army is to control the population.
Mm-hmm.
Yet now, I would not know whether that is the case.
Well,
There's a lot of
yeah.
gatherings going on in Champs-Élysées, and
Yeah.
So what I'm trying
yeah.
to say is that how do you see these invisible boundaries that you talked about, the economic? No, they're not so invisible.
Right.
But Islam. You seem to think that that is the solution, kind of thing, to these urban ills, because they're physical. These urban failures you were describing are buildings failing.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, here's a Kaaba, there's there's skyscrapers behind it.
Right. The contradictions get exposed there, but I mean there are multiple. Yeah. Yeah.
Excuse me.
Mm-hmm.
Forgive
No,
me for
please.
interrupting. Is that the fact that we don't see the contradiction is why they were built.
Yes.
You see, so and these are Muslims building it. These are Saudi king is building this, and doesn't see the failure, visual failure.
Mm-hmm. There's a lot.
But you show it as a success. You showed it as a success.
What?
The Kaaba.
No. Not the clock towers. No success whatsoever. It's a destruction.
But you have to look at it together.
Yeah. But I mean, there's a lot sort of in there. And I mean, look, I mean, one of the ways in which we can start thinking about, I mean, this public space commons, it's not an either or, and it's not, there are ways in which, as I said, public space to me is statist and market oriented. But there are times and places when public space can actually be transformed. Tahrir Square, it was a public space before it was occupied. Then it became a commons. And we saw the ways in which that commons then people organized and created pharmacies and shops and this and that kind of thing. The ways in which they created sort of an ethics of interacting with one another even on the square, right? And so it's not black and white either, or this is a public space, that's a commons, this, that, the other. They change based on our usage, okay? So with Champs-Élysées now, what we see is, say in Paris, is almost this total pacification through commodification. Okay? And so what we see, if you go to Champs-Élysées now, it's now just lined with overpriced cafes, because that's the Paris experience, the sidewalk cafe. Drink your espresso or your wine, whatever it may be. Or these extremely expensive, chic sort of brand stores, right? The glass and gold and this and that all shining, the Louis Vuitton, et cetera, all sort of there now. So now we're pacified just to go either just ogle at the sort of the spectacle of commodification and consumerism, right? Go to the Bon Marché, okay, which is one of the first department stores ever from the, I don't even know when it started, 1850s, 60s, right, ever. And I mean, it's just, it's mind-boggling, right, of the ways in which consumption is actually practiced and acted out. And so there are ways in which now it's not about going out to the Champs-Élysées and walking your dog and wearing your top hat and coat and being seen by society as much as it is this kind of pacification through consumption, okay? So, but there are times then when demonstrations, unions, others go on strike, organize, they can occupy these spaces. But as I said, there are ways in which public space is organized to make that even more difficult. Okay, and more of a challenge. Building this giant flagpole in the middle of Tahrir makes it almost impossible now to occupy Tahrir. Okay? There's no space to occupy. It's been taken over by this flagpole, right? And so there are ways in which, in a sense, the state then realizes its mistakes and plans then accordingly. And so, again, the wideness of the Champs-Élysées actually denies people possibilities for organizing, at least on Champs-Élysées. You can't build a barricade there, right? In the same way, I mean, our interstate system in the United States, I mean, does anybody know why we built the interstate system in the 1950s? What its primary purpose was? Airplanes. No. It was actually to move atomic warheads, okay? It was military based to move atomic, I mean, it was the Cold War going on, this, that. And so it was actually meant to, and that's why they're so wide, et cetera, it was defense purposes, right? And of course, but we use them differently and create access, but they're structured in a way that was actually, at least initially and originally, militaristic, right? Most of us don't know that. We go on them all the time, drive on them. We use them differently. So the intent and the usage are different, right? But sometimes that intent structures the way in which we use them. So where did the highways go, the interstates? What cities do they go to? What cities do they not go to, right? Where was the train tracks built? Which town did they link? Which town did they deny access? And so we are actually structured in our movements based on that infrastructural planning that might have some logic, whatever, but it means some people have access and some people don't. Some regions you have access to, others you don't, right? So there are ways in which things are planned and structured for a certain reason that have then rippling effects. There are ways in which we use them and often usurp or disrupt, right? It's the term I use. Those planning sort of visions, okay? So it's just this tension between the planned and the usage that I want to emphasize. Right? Yeah?
Back to Tahrir Square. Tahrir Square, I'm thinking of the distinction between human beings and population. And people in Tahrir Square were feeling like human beings at that time because they are lacking
Mhm.
There's the separation and the removal of the American university in Egypt to take it away. It was part of a project, from my point of view, of taking also the new Cairo, which was enough to interrupt by the revolution, taking
Yes.
all governmental institutions, all symbols of power and economic power and political power, taking them out of Cairo, building communities for the rich away from Cairo. It's like getting rid of all the Cairo overcrowded places and these poor people and having our own space,
Mhm.
a different
Right.
and also, I mean, what I believe is that this kind of spatial discrimination and the idea of environmental justice and the lack of environmental justice in Egypt is that the slums, building the slums, the overcrowded places, separating them, affects also the moral and spiritual practices of these people. And this is how the idea of fundamentalism started in these areas. People are getting fed up of this injustice and are searching for other solutions. They are looking for a way to end this kind of corruption. They are blaming the statements are helpless, and so these poor places became source of vulnerability. But also I want to say something about Said Qutb, because the idea
About?
of Said Qutb
Mm.
and that he invented the idea of charity. I disagree with
Mhm.
this because Said Qutb is one of the founders of Muslim Brotherhood, and it's a very fundamentalist and patriarchal group. And this idea we used to control the population. We start to give people money,
Mhm.
help them get education, give them, provide them social services, which the state refused
Mhm.
from giving them. And so when they came to power, they asked these people, because we gave you money before, we helped you, come and give us your voice. And when they come to power, they did nothing to achieve the idea of justice. So it's not about the charity,
Right.
giving, and responsibility. It's a different way, logical way to control the population from my point
Yeah.
of view.
That's a good and very valid point. I'll start with that one. And I think, I mean, yes, right? And in fact, what's interesting, I think, with the way in which the Muslim Brotherhood operates, I mean, Sayyid Qutb and his idea, and it's not something I've engaged deeply, okay, in his writings and all. But this differentiating charity and zakat as two different things, and charity as this very sort of liberal Western Christian idea and concept, right, compared to the Islamic principle, okay? And so that difference is itself, I think, significant to kind of make. The Muslim Brotherhood, if you ask me, is in fact a Christianized, a very Protestantized Islam that's predicated on charity and not zakat. It's predicated on certain Protestant ideas that it institutionalizes into Islam. And so it actually corrupts those thoughts and actually, in a sense, corrupts Islam and creates it into a certain political and social organization, as you're sort of talking about. So I think, that's very valid. But what I'm just trying to distinguish between what I'm simplifying as a sort of a liberal concept of charity and a Muslim practice of zakat. One of the thinkers of that was Qutb. He might have had sort of intentions. I don't think that's in his own writings. I think that's what the Muslim Brotherhood as an organization ends up doing with it, okay? And actually corrupts zakat.
I'm against the idea of charity. People need justice.
Mhm.
They need to be given their basic rights.
Right.
Okay, not to be dealt with as poor and giving them charity.
Mhm.
And I'm having these ideas. The idea of charity is a way of controlling people.
Absolutely. Well, that's what I'm arguing. Yeah, I think we agree.
So it's
Yeah.
the same idea of
Yeah.
patriarchism as well.
Yeah.
And that is why when they came to power, they failed because
Mhm.
they are not looking for justice as a claim.
Right.
And they are definitely not representing Islam as well.
Exactly.
And these honor crimes, in Islam, there is nothing called differentiation between men and women when it comes to adultery or sexual offenses, but it is a law. In Egypt, if a man kills his wife because he thinks, even if he didn't go to, he is not taken to prison, but if she got him with the act of adultery, she will be executed.
Right.
So it's the law that builds this patriarchal idea, not
Yeah.
not the Quran itself.
Yeah.
It's the way we interpret
But
and
I would caution, I think we would agree on a very fundamental level with these things. And maybe you're just misunderstanding how I'm trying to map these terms. But one of the problems that you're getting into is that somehow there's an authentic Islam out there. The Muslim Brotherhood isn't it. These people legislate honor killing, etc. That's not it. Somewhere out there. And that's also problematic. Because any idea of authentic, pure Islam is also a corruption. The Muslim Brotherhood, the Saudi Wahhabis, everybody sort of claims this is Islam and what it's supposed to be, and therefore we have to cleanse the others, right? And so one of the most difficult challenges we have is how do you engage, encounter, enter into dialogue with that who actually thinks you are illegal and impure? And there's no simple answer to that.
Our form of modernity
Yeah.
in all our countries,
Yeah.
there is no intellectual modernity, and when it comes to Islam,
Hmm.
even in Azhar, which is the official representative of Islam, and it's moderate in Egypt, we refuse any kind of modernizing
Yeah.
with argumentation about
Mhm.
some parts, not of the Quran,
Mhm.
even the Hadith, which are
Right.
the sayings of the Prophet, which people are taking them as if they are part of the
Mhm.
Quran, and we can see the case of Islam al-Bahari. He is a
Right.
young intellectual. He was
Yeah.
put in prison because he just started to challenge
Right.
these sayings.
Which is why it comes back to
It's the
what.
idea of modernity.
Right.
It's not being building buildings.
Yeah.
It's also intellectual.
Exactly.
We are
Yep. Yeah. And I think that's what becomes important to really look at usage and practices. And so those ethics that people actually employ and draw upon, and where do they come from, and in a sense, what are the intents or implications of those? And I just, another sort of quick comment that you're talking about as sort of the radical sort of fundamentalists coming out of the Ashawatis in Cairo, and particularly, I mean, Dar es Salaam and other neighborhoods are particularly sort of portrayed as the spaces of radicalism in Cairo, and plus drugs and all this other kind of stuff that kind of things on. That's a problematic construct. If you actually go into those spaces, they're radically different than the stories we have about them. And they're extremely rich. They're not necessarily good. There's a lot of ways in which, and particularly gender and all these other things, get played out in these back alleys. Very problematic. But they're also very culturally rich. They're very sort of engaged with what it means to be Muslim, what it means to be a Karen, what it means to be an Egyptian. I mean, these are debates that are taking place amongst them that rarely middle and upper middle class Egyptians actually listen to. And so, because they're excluded from the table, right? And that's the biggest problem. And they know they're excluded. And so the ways in which exclusion takes place, right, becomes significant. And I think, but we also have to think, when we're thinking about fundamentalism, that some of the biggest impacts, if you will, or effects, isn't necessarily what's coming out of sort of the lower working class who are, yes, things are happening, right? But you also have to look at Amr Khalid, TV evangelists, right? And there are others in South Asia, Zakir Naik, and others in Indonesia, et cetera, who have an extremely powerful impact on upper class, right? Policymakers, the beneficiaries of the neoliberal capitalist sort of corrupt regimes that are embedded in the Muslim world, right? Their impact is actually just as equal in creating a kind of purified fundamentalist in its original term, not as a radical terrorist, but fundamentalist is somebody who believes in the fundamentals of a religion, right? That's kind of puritanization of Islam actually comes more out of those than what's happened in the back alleys of shanty towns and informal cities and other places. So I think it's important to also move away from the ways in which we simplify the portrayal of those people, right? You're gonna.
Hey, it was a great presentation. I've been
Thank
through
you.
Islamabad several times.
Mm.
And during your presentation, I kept thinking of the Pakistani joke that the best thing about it is it's only 20 minutes from Pakistan.
Yes.
You know, I was just curious though, the absolutist cities, the absolutist communities, you made it sound like this system of policing, of hierarchies based sometimes on the cost of living is pretty much locked down. In all the cases you looked at, were there any situations where it started to collapse in some way? Because I know the market you showed in Islamabad, you said that was set up originally, and it wasn't something where it came in later on.
No.
I mean, did you see examples outside of like a Tahrir Square government pulls back and people build their own ramp. Did you see any cases where the absolutist community started to break down in some way?
In Islamabad?
Well, anywhere.
Yeah.
I mean, because you made it sound like
Yeah.
there's no escaping.
No.
I mean, it's basically
There's
you
no
know, the
way
system-
out.
Yeah, there's no way for like a traditional community to.
It's the
cover it
iron
in some way.
cage. We are there. Yes, and I mean, they're very powerful ways, I think, in which, and again, maybe I overemphasized that and created too much of a binary between the absolutist and the dialogical, if you will. And I don't, that was perhaps a mistake in the way I presented this, but I think absolutism is never absolute, okay? And I think that's the first thing we have to realize, that even under the most sort of radically imposed absolutist regimes, the most sort of totalitarian, the most sort of oppressive, there are always disruptions of that, the ways in which people negotiate that. So, and that's what I'm looking at, not just those practices, but in a sense, how do people even understand that? So there are different ways in which it's been upset. And I'm just focusing on Islamabad. There are ways in which one might, and again, we're simplifying the term, but the fundamentalists actually disrupt this liberal idea of the city. So from the early 2000s on, the ways in which actually the mosque that's actually near this market area is called the Red Mosque, right? And so there's a big incident there in 2007. But the ways in which they started to police, but impose their own sort of absolutist ideas, they were called chicks with sticks. And so these completely burqa-clad with niqab sort of women who most people actually thought were actually men, went on the streets with batons and beat up like stores that had were selling DVDs because films are corrupting, and anybody who's selling particular alcohol underneath the counter started just picking up Chinese women walking on the street because it was just assumed all the Chinese women were prostitutes. And so the way in which they themselves cleansed the city. Now we can see that that's an attempt to kind of purify in a particular way, but it completely disrupts, obviously, the liberal imaginaire of the city, right? And so it was put down in a very kind of violent way, and which has had rippling and sort of lasting effects on people there. But there are other ways too, in a sense, that we might sort of start see in ways in which communities, one is these shanty towns, right? I think are extremely sort of important in the ways in which particularly the poor who are so sort of marginalized within cities, how they themselves find the spaces to sort of live and operate. Dubai, I think, is perhaps more sort of classic examples. The impurities in Dubai are sort of the laborers and what come to be termed as bachelors, okay? Dubai is a city that's branding itself and selling itself as a space for sort of the elite and this kind of chic upper class come by sort of the global dream kind of thing. But it's all predicated on laborers building the buildings, running the stores, cleaning them, etc. But where do you put them? And nobody wants to see them, right? So one way of dealing with the movement of laborers who are normally on the street waiting for buses and then become sort of an unsightly scene, right, is put them underground. So if you've ever been to Disneyland, right, Disney World, you will never see an unemployed worker walking. They're off duty, they're going back. There are actually all these secret doors. So as soon as your time is up, your shift, you go underground. And there are all these tunnels then that take you back out kind of thing, your lunch break, whatever. So you never actually see an employee who's not working at Disneyland, right? In the same way that when the building of a subway in Dubai was actually partially imagined as a way of keeping the workers out of sight, put them underground, okay? The problem is, as soon as it was built, it actually provided access to all these places that laborers never had access to before. The beaches, the five-star gated communities, the marina, which is this upscale sort of part of the city. So now all of a sudden, you actually have more of them visible than you did before. So they actually disrupted the idea by creating access. They can go to the high-end malls now and not just in their little neighborhoods, because now it's easy to get there, right? So there are ways in which you sort of imagine a certain possibility, but the ways in which we actually, through our usage, end up with something quite different. And I mean, one can go on and on with those type of examples.
Just a really quick
Yep.
question on that. So is it rare for, like, why not have these workers live with the families that they are working for? Because I know, and I don't know, in areas of the Levant, there's a lot of Southeast Asian workers that typically live with these, like,
Yeah.
middle class, upper middle class families that they work for. Is that not necessarily the case?
Yeah. No, and I mean, sometimes it happens. Again, it depends on wealth, of course, because it costs more to have a continuous servant than a day servant. But it's also design a house. You have to have quarters, right? And so where do you place them? And so that wasn't really planned. And it's really fascinating. You go out to New Cairo, right? And so all these sort of fancy homes and the sort of the designs and stuff, and you start talking about people. Most of them have fireplaces, right? It's Egypt, right? Okay, might be one night it gets a little cool, but there's no wood to burn, so what do you do with a fireplace? And so I was talking to one of the developers, and he said, well, this is what people want. He said, why? Well, because they go to magazines, and they see that this is what a villa looks like from Europe or the United States, and say, oh, this is what we want. So they design it in a certain way, right? And so that design gets interacted. It's partly imposed, but it's partly our expectation of what a villa looks like. But it doesn't always allow those type of spaces, right? And really just fascinating, I mean, looking at the microspace of the home just quickly. In certain areas of the world, homes were traditionally one space, right? And particularly where I did my research in Pakistan, the traditional home was one space, and there was a fire pit in the middle. Anybody who came to visit, the woman was there, okay, traditional role, making tea, doing whatever, but everybody's sitting around the fire talking, right? And there they needed fire. It was quite cold in the wintertime, okay? And so then everybody started to make money, and now they wanted a modern home. So now you have bedrooms, you have a sitting room, and you have the kitchen. Where's the kitchen? Well, it's in the back. So now where are the women? They're in the back. And the men are now sitting up front. The modern home actually segregated women out of dialogue and interaction. The modern home was also needed space, so they had to move it out of the sort of the cluster of the village into the field. So now she doesn't, I mean, the next neighbor is a kilometer away, right? And so there are ways in which modernity itself actually maps segregation and separation along gender lines, where we often think of modernity as liberating women. When most practices of modernity are actually sort of impositions on women, their bodies, and their lives. Right?
I think we should wrap it up.
Last question.
Last question.
Squeezed in.
Yeah, I don't want to. I really appreciated the whole thing, and especially kind of the anarchist bent of it. But I take a little bit of issue with always aligning the state and the market on the same side of the dichotomy. I feel like there are probably more cases in which that is kind of a correct alignment, but I think it's important to acknowledge times when the state acts as sort of a protective barrier against market forces. One example that comes to mind immediately is like public libraries in this country, or like which is a place that is a public space that's state created that allows these kinds of commons to like happen very naturally, because there are houseless people are hanging out there and kids are hanging out there, and there's so much access provided for all different sort of levels of socioeconomic status and like ability or different abilities or whatever. And so like how do you think of like the kind of state, the situations in which like the state is acting as like a facilitator for commons, like consciously? And then that sort of feeds into the second part of my question, which you encourage us to think about gendered access to spaces, and I think that that's like another example of like state sort of facilitating positively in some cases, for lack of a better word, because I think that like, I mean, you kind of admitted a little bit to like orientalizing and romanticizing the super or the bizarre,
Yes.
which like those spaces are often like very
gendered.
unsafe for women. I mean, I think like when it Egypt, there were, there was like more community policing and
Yeah.
protecting women, but like on a day-to-day basis, in a lot of marketplaces,
Yeah.
there's like a horrible sort of way high
Yep.
rate of abuse.
A good corrective, I think, and I mean, perhaps in my own rhetorical style, sort of created these sort of reproducing binaries, but sort of pure ideas, and they're not so pure. And I think, I think the examples you come up with are very significant. And in many ways, what you're sort of talking about too is the ways in which the state protects against certain market interests and doesn't allow us to go that way. That itself is also a powerful sort of ways in which, particularly what we might sort of consider traditional liberal state versus the neoliberal state. And we're in a period of transition or debate, but the liberal state was in many ways the welfare state. And it invested in communities and projects and public spaces and these other things. Absolutely, libraries and others. It provided welfare system, provided health care. I mean, all these things that we're also sort of dependent on, compared to the neoliberal state, which wants to privatize these things and make them sort of the product of the marketplace, right? And profit or not, whether they're profitable or not. And so those attempts to sort of protect some of that is still inherent within our system, right? But the tension is there and playing out. And so we actually have to sort of struggle to latch on to sort of do away with sort of the neoliberal attack, right? The other is, in a sense, going the other side when I start talking about some of these dialogical spaces that, yes, there are, gender, wasn't perfect historically or even contemporary in these spaces. They remain highly gendered spaces and classist and racist in different places and the way those get played out. And so how does that, what's at work though there? And what's defining that? So again, just quickly, where I'd done my original work in northern Pakistan, small sort of town, once the highway into the town was built, and this is like talk about highways, but it brought people, strangers. And as soon as those strangers came, then women were forced to disappear. So, but what was the matter? And so as a stranger, if you go into the city, you actually don't see women in the bazaar, in the market area. And it's a highly masculinized space. But if you're somewhat familiar with the city and you go into the back alleys, there's a whole nother city. And it's interactive and much more sort of dialogical. There are women's spaces, women's shops, women are moving around. Yes, it is segregated, okay, and problematic that way. It's not based on equality. But there are creative ways then in which women operate under that oppression. And so these traditional dialogical spaces, or this kind of desire to sort of imagine dialogical spaces, how do we free them from these just multiple levels of kind of oppression and power that we want to sort of impose upon them, right? But also to recognize that we have the possibility to sort of creatively work around those, right? Or to challenge them in certain ways. And so sometimes our challenge is direct, sometimes it's indirect by creating new possibilities, right? But at no place is that dialogical space pure. As soon as it becomes pure, it's actually dead, right? And so it's always a space of struggle, right? And that's what sort of has to be kind of emphasized, right? And that we don't become pacified in our engagement with it and our living within them, okay? Hope that. Good comments. Thank you all for your questions. Very sort of critically engaged. Really appreciate it very much. It's been great. Educational.